Hello, friends. There's nothing on the agenda today. So maybe we don't have a meeting.
Good morning. Hey, Arnold. Hi, Eddie.
Hey, Rion.
How you doing?
Good.
It is that time of the year where my calendar gets confused because the meeting reminder on my phone was for now, but the calendar event is for in an hour. So it's that time zone flipping thing that.
Yeah, we're sorry.
I didn't think you invented time zones, did you?
No.
Well, here there's a lot of talk everywhere about abolishing the whole idea. Not time zones, the time, what do you call it, the daylight saving.
Yeah, so I did some work for Apple at some point for their retail stores, and they gave us like a small window that we could ship files to stores, and it was like between 2 or 4 a.m. or something, but that means something different in every single time zone. And there's like 15-minute time zone, and there's like a leap 30 minutes. And yeah, I learned a lot. Don't ever want to do it again.
The way time zones work.
So we do have some folks. There's nothing on the agenda. I don't know if anyone had anything they wanted to discuss.
Okay, pardon the lack of video. I'm having some issues with Zoom. If we don't have other stuff on the agenda, I'd like to discuss the working group reliability work proposal, kind of moving forward on reliability.
That sounds good to me.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I've been trying to get Zoom working. Let me add a link to the agenda.
I don't know if Cole, if you had anything you wanted to discuss.
No, I don't have anything specific.
There's a couple things that came out of some of the leads meetings and the community meeting last week. We need to get some onboarding docs, not docs, but we need to figure out onboarding for new contributors when it comes to like Prow and Test Grid in general. I think Jordan and I were talking about maybe recording some more videos. So if anyone is interested or has ideas around that, feel free to let us know.
Yeah, we're planning to continue adding stuff to the Proud documentation website. I know we have a PR out right now with a detailed diagram of the functioning of Tide. So we're working on that, and that's pretty helpful.
That's awesome. I also talked to SIG release this morning, and the CI signal team is also working on their onboarding documentation and stuff. So yeah, hopefully there's a good effort to get people educated on how this stuff works better.
Yeah, I think we have some good existing resources scattered around too. There's like a job cookbook that can be pretty useful to people trying to use Prow. Yeah, I think it's probably just not located well. So having everything on the site should make it a lot more accessible.
Yeah, I'm not even thinking about writing proud jobs right now. I'm thinking about people who have to like track down failing tests and flakes and yeah, things they've probably never seen before.
Josh, you have some video now. It's just very dark.
Yeah, the Zoom client is not working properly, and I'm using the web thing, which seems to have hardware problems. So the anyway, if we want to move on to the reliability discussion. So WG Reliability came up with a proposal for how to handle Kubernetes declining reliability in their terms. I'm not entirely personally sure that reliability is declining, but
Oh, Josh, sorry.
I would, yeah.
Sorry, I don't
Yeah?
even know if we didn't kick off the meeting right. So let's do that real quick.
Okay, let's do that then.
Yeah. So just a reminder, this meeting is recorded. Everything you say will be on the internet. This meeting and all Kubernetes and CNCF meetings abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct. So please be excellent to each other. And I see we have Ben. Hooray.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, Josh, you want to take back over?
Okay, cool. So we have this KEP proposal from reliability working group about how to handle Kubernetes, at least lack of improvement in overall reliability over the last couple of years. As you can see from the comments, I have some disagreements with approach, but regardless, it does feel that clearly we, as a project, we need to be doing something to produce continuous reliability improvement, which is not really a thing right now. And so I've been taking it around to the community meeting and to some of the key SIGs, which would be release, architecture enhancements, and now testing, about what do people have ideas of feasible steps that we could take that would produce reliability improvement over time. Both from the reliability working group's proposal and for anything we conceivably would do, testing is obviously going to be key. Both from the community meeting last week, which unfortunately the video is not up for yet due to technical issues, and from other stuff. First, working with reliability was proposing using SIPI, which, as far as I know, is not yet functional. One of the pieces of feedback that we heard from several people at the community meeting was that one of the things contributing to reliability not improving is that general contributors have difficulty analyzing and debugging their own work via test grid. Particularly because these days a lot of the failures and the flaky test issues happen in E2E tests that occur at a delay from the merging of the code. And so it's hard for people to figure out that their code is responsible, and therefore they just ignore the problem. Okay, Arnaud, you said we've got a functional instance of SIPI. Oh, that's
Yeah, we
yeah.
talked about that during SIG release today, and basically
Okay.
one specific team inside Red Hat offer a functional instance of CP was basically looking for SIG release input about how we can share knowledge between, I would say, OpenShift team and SIG release.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also bring up that we've had the longstanding triage tool that lets you drill into like where test failure is happening. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah. And it may be that the primary problem is just that people don't know how to use the tools that we have. In which case it's more of an education campaign, which would be great, honestly, because that's something that contributor experience could potentially handle.
Yeah, if that is the case, we have some pretty excellent content that Jordan put together. We have it captured in a doc and in a video recording on like how to triage flaky tests using these tools.
Yeah. Okay. So education program there, something for contributor experience maybe to put together to make sure that everybody knows how to connect the dots. But then the other question is, this sort of thing of, for example, not having overall improvement in the number of flaky tests, or and having kind of overall decline in test coverage. This is not a new problem for SIG testing. This is a problem that, as far as I know, we have always had, as long as we have had, from like year 2 of the project. And seems like y'all would have some ideas about what the rest of the project should be doing to address this.
Well, in the past, we've instrumented coverage, and we found that we didn't have much success getting anyone to look at it. So at this point, I think some of our coverage tracking is just not even fully functional because I think there's insufficient incentive to care about this. Right. Even like the unit tests, we don't really keep that dashboard as functional. There's been some specific focus on conformance coverage. And I think we've made great progress there. But as a more general rule, coverage from unit tests and E2E tests, even if sig testing provides the tools to be able to dig into this, it doesn't seem to have follow through. I'm not sure how to change that.
If somebody else, contributor experience, steering, whoever was taking on the, hey, we will make the rest of the project care about this, or working group reliability, how difficult would it be to get those dashboards working again?
It probably wouldn't be too bad. I think a number of them have failed just due to things like the test lengths have increased and you pay a performance penalty instrumenting for conformance or for coverage. So some of them we probably just need to give them more time or resources to run.
Yeah. Grant was asking about coverage percentage pre-submits. I'm not clear on how that would work.
We've implemented this in some other places, or my team has, where we basically have a post-submit record the coverage amount, and then you can have the pre-submit check against the recorded amount and fail if it dips. I'm not a huge fan of these. I think it sort of just drives checkbox coverage. Like, okay, I got something to exercise the code path. Now the coverage number will pass. Doesn't mean you actually have like good comprehensive tests. But it's something we could consider.
Yeah. I mean, because one of the things that was actually raised during the community discussion was people were suggesting, saying that one of the sources of problems is that enhancement submitters are often allowed to postpone submitting E2E tests. And of course, postponement sometimes means postponement forever.
Yeah,
So I think there might be some appetite for having more stringent requirements
I think that
for
that
tests on
the
enhancement submission.
yeah, I think that reviewers checking for like their concept of sufficient test coverage makes more sense. Also say unit test coverage is probably like we're actually I think pretty good where we can be good, and there's other things that just don't really unit test. And for E2E coverage, it's not super viable to stick that in pre-submit because the performance penalty of instrumenting everything is kind of high, and it doesn't directly correlate. There's some noise in it due to the exact behaviors that happen and things like that.
Yes. The
It's useful for
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
some idea where we're at. It probably isn't suitable for blocking on.
Okay.
But that would be the number that I'm probably more concerned about myself, would be that we're exercising everything in E2E. And that as well, we're not going to run all of the E2Es in a given job. There's just too many of them. It will take too long. We have to shard out a bit and say like, okay, we're alpha testing over here. So if you want to know the true number, you have to look across many jobs. And again, we're not going to run all those in pre-submit.
Okay. Okay. I was just, the Grant asked there.
Yeah, it could be reasonable to block on unit test coverage, but I don't think that's the problem we're discussing.
It's kind of all out there, right? We have the visible parts of lack of improvement in reliability, which in my experience is primarily A, flaky tests, test jobs, and B, upgrade downgrade failures, which we see both in our testing and in the field.
Well, we almost don't have upgrade downgrade. Downgrade has no CI, and upgrade has very, very minimal CI.
Yes, because downgrade broke and nobody wanted to fix it.
Well, and there's even people that disagree that it should be a thing that we support. So
well, I was going to say if downgrade doesn't work, then upgrade needs to work flawlessly.
Right. But either way, we have very, very, very limited coverage. I mean, one of the things that we bring it further on there, one of the things we tend to run into is the vast majority of CI ultimately has to run on our GCE testing because that's where we have resources. But no one wants to be responsible for those scripts. So a few folks like me are doing this in our very vast spare time. And it's just not sustainable and it's not great tooling. So things like upgrade, like the folks that are approving the code right now really don't have time to be fixing upgrades, or there's no one responsible for upgrade. And often the problem is actually with the like upgrading and not necessarily like one of the components, and it's hard to tell.
So okay, but you'd agree with my assessment that one of like our sort of super critical areas is kind of lack of meaningful upgrade testing.
I think it's something that is highly overlooked. How critical it is, I guess, sort of depends on your priorities.
Okay.
It is something
speaking as somebody who works for a vendor, I would identify this as a critical area.
I think right now vendors are testing for of their like distro and catching things there, which works for them, but means we're catching things late typically. So I would add, I think from my point of view, we have these lengthy release cycles with a freeze period, and we tag all these betas and alphas, but I don't think anyone's running those builds.
No, one of the to-dos that's been kind of perpetually kept alive from the bot since I was release lead, actually, almost 2 years ago now, is make it easier for the public to consume alphas and betas.
I don't have a super easy answer there, but I do think that
Yeah. Well, it
Like-
was going to be a huge.
I think that's one of the things that we have that should be able to catch some of these problems, but isn't really utilized.
Mhm.
When their tests are failing, because I thought that was the point of code freeze, is
Mhm.
that we're not releasing until the tests are passing. If
Yeah.
the tests are like good enough to be gating things, like we have the release blocking dashboard, maybe more things need to be in release blocking.
Yeah, well, we've gone in release. We've done this thing for a number of years where we've said, "Hey, if this test is going to be in release blocking, it needs to be not so flaky." And taking the job back to the SIG that owns the job, and the SIG saying we're not going to fix it.
That's fair.
And therefore the job comes out of release blocking, right? Because at some point the project makes a decision. If the project is going to release something despite a test failing, then that test is clearly not release blocking.
Well, I would add that that's, I think, a good example of my other concern, which is that if we say that this is the gate, that your SIG must have reliable
Mhm.
enough tests, then I'm disincentivized from going and adding more tests because I have to keep all of them passing to do anything.
You can see my arguments and other people's as to why focusing on this as we're going to block a SIG's enhancements is going to be counterproductive, which is my opinion. So I mean, I do think talking to some of the current release team CI people and that sort of thing, is the release team has really been led to the idea that it's their job to make the test pass or fudge instead of blocking the release. I mean, if I compare to how we behaved in the release team, 2 or more years ago, versus, how the releases run now, is the release team has been told to prioritize the timeline over passing the tests. And I'm not sure that was a good decision. And the decision could be revisited.
So I see a number of other folks in this call that haven't said anything yet. Does anyone else have thoughts on this
I'd
problem?
say, as the relatively new guy here, you've got tests that are supposed to be blocking your release that you're taking out of the way that you're not going to fix, right? And then I kind of lost my train of thought, but essentially it sounds like some of the that was the other thing, is that the release team was saying that it was their job to fudge or fix tests to make them pass. And we started the conversation with, there's a perception that there's reliability issues. Surprise.
Yeah.
I personally am not sure I've seen like fudging, but I do feel like they feel responsible for getting the test to pass and have done quite a bit of chasing folks around trying to get things fixed. And it doesn't seem super sustainable. But like, even stepping further back, there's only so much that we're actually blocking on to begin with, and something like upgrade is not one of those things.
Yeah, well, it's I mean, overall the result has been the master blocking test suite today is less than half the size it was 2 years ago, right? And that's not because Kubernetes has a whole bunch less code.
I put in chat, but what SIGs are saying we're not going to fix our tests? Like that's the bigger problem than.
I don't think anybody overtly says this. It's more like, if you say like, I want this job to be in the release blocking dashboard, they say like, we don't have time for it. It's not just like fixing your tests or something, right? To get a job into release blocking dashboard, there's a process you need to go through, and a big part of it is you need to keep your job very stable for a period of time to show that it is a reliable signal, and that the job can be stable, and that if it is unstable, we must have had a bad change. And as someone who's brought some jobs through that, it's really time consuming. Like, one of the main things I'm doing when I'm getting the kind project ready to be able to be used in our CI is just trying to create the perception that like this is actually a reliable way to test, and I have to go running around fixing things, because until it's a blocking job, people make changes that subtly break the job, and you have to go through our huge amount of changes and find what broke it, get it fixed. And if you don't fix that fast enough, you don't have a green period on your dashboard that you can point to. So you have to, I would say, to even get that viable, you have to really get to a point where you have multiple people paying attention to this and starting to already treat it as sort of pseudo blocking. Like if it went red, something's wrong, we need to fix it and get it stable, get it into somewhat blocking. If you have this purely in post submit, that can be extra hard because there's no signal on a PR that like this was going to break this thing. We've had examples of this before where things that should be totally viable get knocked out and never come back. We used to test with KOps on AWS and pre-submit, but we ran into the billing account being suspended there, and it has never recovered since. It was a billing issue. It wasn't that it stopped functioning. It was that we weren't able to run CI because the account wasn't paid up. And once the account was paid up again, that it has never come back, and we don't have that coverage. Now, I think we're moving in a direction where that's not the sort of thing we want. We're not trying to test like on more cloud providers or something like that. That isn't necessarily what we want in pre-submit to begin with. Maybe we want to get away from all of them, but it's an example of like everything involved should have been totally stable. But once you lose being that blocking thing, the momentum to get back in blocking is high. The activation energy is very high. And that's something that was even in pre-submit.
Yeah. And well, and the thing is that, when we started out with the release team, we had the opposite, right? Which is we had lots of tests that would kind of fail randomly. And their failures didn't mean anything. And so you had the release team scrambling, on a pretty much daily basis to figure out whether the test failure was meaningful or not, which would then obscure the test failures that actually were meaningful. But yeah, there's not a lot of motivation for SIGs to promote their own tests because it's a lot of work. And it doesn't solve a problem for them necessarily, at least not right now.
Yeah, there's a very high bar of motivation there. It has to be something where, whoever's paying you to spend time on this, presumably because it costs a really large amount of time. I'd be surprised to see purely volunteers doing these. You have to convince them that you need this to be tested in release blocking upstream. I've known a few examples in my employer, they've happened, but it's not very common because a lot of times, like maybe just having some test signal that you can monitor is good enough. Getting it into release blocking is an expensive undertaking, and the reward is not necessarily high for you individually. It's sort of more like, hopefully for the whole project, we have better signal here.
Yeah. I wanted to answer Eddie's question by explaining like one case of where a test job becomes we won't fix it. That happened when I was doing CI signal for the release team. So this was a while ago. Again, a couple of years ago. You would have to ask somebody who's currently on CI signal for any contemporary examples of this. But really what it comes and this comes down to we used to have both upgrade and downgrade tests. And a whole battery of upgrade tests, which still exist within SIG cluster lifecycles test grid. And what happened over time was that SIG cluster lifecycle's pool of contributors became identical to the kubeadmin contributors. As in there was not people who were part of SIG cluster lifecycle who didn't work on kubeadmin. And so we had a bunch of upgrade tests that were based largely on KOps. And they belonged to SIG cluster lifecycle because upgrade tests. And SIG cluster lifecycle said, this is KOps. We're not going to maintain or troubleshoot these anymore because we don't care about KOps. but their own. So we said, okay, we'll swap in the kubadmin upgrade test, right? Because you want to maintain kubadmin, which we did for a while, but it turns out that with cluster life cycles workflow, they were okay for those with those tests going red for weeks at a time, which was obviously not acceptable if they're going to be master blocking. So we ended up without upgrade tests at all in master blocking. I mean, so that's an example of the sort of thing that happens. I mean, often it's not so much you take a job that is clearly owned by a SIG to that SIG and they say, we're not going to fix it. A lot of times what happens is you take a job to a SIG that ostensibly owns the job and they say, well, our name is only on that job for historical reasons, but none of that code is ours. And since it's not ours, we're not going to fix it.
For the GCE tests, I also, for the team that was like, okay, we need upgrade tests to cover this thing that I think it was
Mhm.
and so they put a bunch of effort into getting the like upgrade tests. Because another bit of thing is that those other tests we're talking about, there isn't any special upgrade testing. It's test, upgrade, test, and it's just the usual tests. We actually had some tests that try to do things across the upgrade. I don't know, have a application running or something. But those are bad from early in the project, not very worked on, and horribly tied into like the GCE clusters and things. It needs to be able to talk to like the deployer to like run the upgrade, and it's not aware of many. Though getting those running again itself has somewhat limited value because no one wants to touch those tests. And so the activation energy to get good upgrade testing, I think, is even further. Someone has to probably start over and write actual good upgrade tests in a way that's going to work with multiple tools so that whatever tool is currently supported, we can work with, and then get that into release blocking. There's a pretty large effort. And I think right now the project on the whole is kind of understaffed on just like basic maintenance in many places, let alone investing in something like this. I can tell you in sig-testing right now, I'm working on the fact that we have a number of projects where in reality, we have like maybe one approver, and so use those things. So we don't really have the bandwidth to do major investments. We're just trying to keep the existing things afloat.
Yeah, it's tricky. I was talking to Jordan last week, and like I still think that there's an onboarding problem. I think even me as a maintainer and lead for the past 2 years still struggle when I have to debug a test, which I spent yesterday doing. And it's not a knock against the tools. It's not against our documentation. It's just that take the terms, for example, pre-submit and post-submit, right? Like those mean nothing to most people who aren't working at Google, right? Like that is not a term I've ever had in any of the 6 companies I've worked at before, right? We've called it something different. And, that's just like little things like that. Like when people see that they get a failing proud job, right? Most people just slash retest and move on, right? They don't know what to do. There's no actionable steps there other than, hey, run slash retest to run me. Right. So it's a bigger problem, and it's definitely the lack of resources and people that we have to put on making it better. So I know Paris is putting I got a sneak peek of a deck that Paris is writing right now for the CNCF, but yeah, we need more dedicated resources and individuals.
Yeah. And let me also suggest, I mean, this reliability conversation is going to bounce around the project for a while. And let me also suggest that it's a good time to make a case for the fact that SIG testing needs help and needs contributors. Which has, honestly been true for a long time. The so the okay. If folks have other ideas, observations, commentary on this, please comment either on the CAP or on the thread I opened up on KDev, so that your thoughts get shared with the rest of the project. Because, like, I think one of the reasons why SIG testing is under-resourced is because people expect it to just work and don't really think about the people who are in this SIG, which happens with a lot of things, right? They're focused on their code and they're like, well, somebody else is taking care of the test.
Mm-hmm. No, that's wrong. In any way you look at it, it's the person that authored the test belongs to them forever and ever and ever.
Yeah, that's the problem, is that all of these tests that I now own, I didn't author, right? They've been handed down from years of other people.
The test should go with the code and the code should go with the test, and they're one and the same, and they should never part. One of the, I guess, general observation is the scope of the group is into the space of governance and process and ownership versus just straight test tool development. So we built these tools so you can measure in some aspect the quality of your code, right? Versus some of the issues that were talked about were along the lines of, well, we ran, I'm not sure. I guess I'm pretty new, but do you guys run these tests, or do we run these tests for everybody such that, or is that just coming from the release teams?
We help run the infrastructure and tools for the tests.
Okay.
But, yeah, one of my back burner things is it would just be so expensive to do, but someday I would love to see this SIG renamed. Everyone thinks we write tests, and nobody here wants to write tests. We're not going to fix the tests.
And then when the test fails, do you pick up and chase somebody down and say your test failed, or do they know their test failed?
We have tools that can let you know that, but you have to opt in to being alerted. Okay. We've done campaigns to get SIGs to set up an email group that gets these or things like that, but no, the main group that actually actively tracks that is there's a subgroup of the release team.
Okay.
The CI signal group that is focused on just the release blocking signal. Those folks will actually go chase people down trying to get tests fixed. But for the entire project at large, I don't think it's even staffable to do that. There's so much CI.
Yeah, no, I don't. I completely think you should not do that. I think I guess it, and I also don't know, is there a central execution environment that is the gatekeeper for all of this, that this all runs in, and if it doesn't pass there, it didn't pass, period?
Yeah, so the vast majority of CIs run on our own homegrown infrastructure, Prow. And we also have a tool, Test Grid, that gives you display of your results, and it can email you on failures. We have some of the CI prevents things from merging.
Okay. Is there a third party that runs elsewhere? OpenStack? Sorry, I said that out loud.
Yeah, there is some CI like that. There's not much that we're really using. So I worked on a program for here, you can run your conformance tests and upload results. And if you get them running continuously against the latest Kubernetes code, and this is stable, then I'll help you push, let's get this into release blocking, because it was hard to get even our base conformance tests in, because then people are like, oh, well, why is I don't know, GCE passing conformance meaningful? Why are we blocking on this? But as SIG testing, I want signal. I want good signal covering these
Yeah.
tests. It's really bad if we release a release and it turns out the conformance tests aren't going to pass
Well,
anywhere.
Right.
yeah.
I would,
But getting a
yeah.
third party to provide like reliable enough results has not been very successful.
And we definitely experimented with it early on, and it was not good.
I think it's important that our contributors are enabled to go fix these things. The things that are in release blocking that does actually happen. The problem is there's a lot more that probably should be in there, and it's hard to scale that up.
right, but well, it's you're kind of damned if you do, because then you leave it in the. Sorry, I shouldn't use bad words on my being recorded. But anyway, you can scale a little bit more effectively when you start involving third parties as well, right? Because then it's not all on you to scale up every single platform that's out there.
Oh, sure. But I mean, as a community, third parties can come help us scale what we have. And it's when we've had like third parties totally run their own thing and just submit results, they haven't, it actually hasn't been much of a scale up. It's usually like 1 or 2 people from the like company or wherever. And then they kind of flake out on us and we lose contact, and it is even less reliable than what we're running, but not actively working on ourselves.
Okay.
Eddie?
I just wanted to give a quick, I don't know, I want to talk through what I worked on yesterday, right? So this was the issue. It started failing 27 days ago, right? I got pinged by the release team. I don't know, when's the first comment by us on here? So 7 days before we noticed it, right? We as a SIG are not looking at all of the, tagged issues. There's just way too much GitHub noise, right? I have almost all GitHub emails muted. And then, so we take a look at this, we dig into the result. There's a problem with these, the cade stable.txt and stable1. So those are for the current stable commit on master, and then back one version. So this would be 123 branch, right? So those weren't there. They didn't get created by some release script that should have created them, right? So boom, like Stephen Augustus figured that out once it got to him, like, what is that, 6 days later? And then another 7 days later or so, we got pinged that it was still failing, even though that those things were there. And this is where I came in to fix this. And this was a failure because I'm curious, like, I'll tell you what the problem was and you tell me where the hole was. So we added a feature to 124 that service account tokens are no longer auto-created for service accounts, right? They're no longer populated. This is a 124 feature that's coming. They are using projected volumes to get them into pods now. So service account no longer has a secret attached to it. This merge just passed all tests. This test was the failing SKU test for one version back on 123. So in this case, it was running the 123 Ginkgo suite against a 124 server. The 123 version of this test waited on a timeout for that specific service account secret to exist on that service account. The fix here was to backport a test change from 124 to 123 that didn't wait for it in a certain way. You can see the commit that I backport, a cherry pick there, right? So where was the hole here? Where should this have been caught on the pre-submits, the post-submits, not master blocking? Was it a bad test?
I think the problem here is, again, that on the whole, the community isn't paying attention to upgrade tests, because otherwise we probably would have thought, we had to make this test change. We need to backport it, like when we made the change, regardless of CI. But this isn't on the brain. And yeah, I mean, we're not going to be able to put everything that's in release blocking into pre-submit. Honestly, we have too much and it's too flaky in pre-submit today. I'll say to the same thing that the release team did with reducing the number. There is a lot to be said for having reliable signal and less of it, just because that means that people pay better attention to failures when they're expecting things to pass. But in like pre-submit, when I send a Kubernetes PR, I'm just like, ugh, tests are failing again. Stupid tests. Like, I'm not really thinking, did I break something? I'm thinking these tests aren't reliable. This is annoying.
There's also what comes around is a certain amount of tribal knowledge of like, you have to ignore those tests, they always fail kind of thing. So it's like, well, why are we running them and who's fixing them? Just get out of my way, your noise. It's not
And
helpful.
we have things for that, but again, it's just like no one's problem to do that. Like you can you can just add a little bit of text to the name of test that says like this is flaky, and then we won't run it in pre-submit. But no one's actively doing this right now. And the problem with doing that is then no one's going to go look at where we do run all the flaky tests and say, oh, but I can fix this one and put it back, because like, why is that your problem? It's just, I think most of the folks that would want to do something like this are just under a deluge of things to deal with already. And it's hard for this to rate.
Yeah, the fix being a backport of a test change, a cherry pick of a test change to a previous release branch, just it still feels wrong to me, right? Like this should have been caught somewhere else.
This is I think the key problem with upgrading though is just that because we have behavior changes frequently, you can't have had the tests anticipate it. It's a tricky problem. And it's just not something anybody's working on. There's too many other understaffed things.
A dumb question on the topic of upgrading. Are you talking about tests that test before and after an upgrade, or during an upgrade, or what does that mean?
We have tests that test before and after. We have some tests that are based on testing around, but that's in very limited use. I'm not sure if anything's actually running today in CI. And then in this case, it's a cluster that's running multiple versions, which isn't strictly an upgrade, but is like one of the main motivations for testing that is, if I upgrade a node, is my cluster still going to work?
Yeah.
Like, so I can have a rolling upgrade.
Well, you can't.
So we call those skew. In our CI, those are all named skew something or other.
Okay. It's an unrealistic scenario that everything's on the same version at the same time. Exactly.
This has been a really useful discussion, but I'm looking at the clock and I want to let Andrew get to his topic.
Yeah. And like I said before, this is not a new problem. This is a problem that we have had for at least 4 years. So we're not going to resolve it in one, or even document all of the aspects of the problem in one meeting.
Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I wanted to spend some time and ask about the current state of kubetest, kubetest 2, and the GCU cloud provider. So for some context, as many of you know, there's this long-running effort to remove the entry cloud provider code, and I think we're at a point where like we've externalized everything, like the CSI plugin, the controller manager, the credential provider, and the kubelet. Everything's kind of externalized, and like the final stretch to really convince ourselves that we're okay to remove things is to have all our tests running with the externalized version of the cloud providers in the test jobs. And so, this is kind of like related to the staffing problems, right? Like, I wouldn't expect anyone in sig testing to like help or take on the work of like converting those jobs. So like, I think it's kind of on our sig to like kind of lead the effort and like see what we can do to slowly convert those jobs. So yeah, like I want to be mindful of staffing problems and try to get a sense of like where would be a good place to start to slowly convert tests to use external cloud providers without destabilizing any existing jobs or anything like that. And I did notice, yeah, like there was some effort around kubetest 2, and it has like a legacy mode and a standard mode to use external provider, but I wasn't sure what the recommended approach for testing external cloud providers is on GCE at least.
I don't know if we can a whole lot about that. I can tell you kubetest 2 should be in a pretty stable state now. It's being used in CI for E2E tests and should be fine. But that's one of those projects where hi, I'm like the only active improver right now. It's very high on my to-do list to change that. But even still, it's probably not going to have super active investment, and there's going to be a really high expense. I don't think the scope of moving all of the things that use the in-tree GCE provider to not moving them is enormous. Like that's most of our CI. And it also raises some interesting questions because we're like not trying to test this out of tree provider or the provider at all. We're just trying to test Kubernetes in most of those. And I think we get to cheat today on the stability of that by like, well, everything blocks on it and it's in the Kubernetes repo. So it better be passing. It's not gonna, like, you can't fundamentally break the cloud provider and merge your PR. But once it's out of tree, that gets closer to where we've been with COPS, where folks need to be convinced that this is like reliable and that there's a stable version that we're using for Kubernetes CI, or else there's going to be a push to remove it everywhere.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because I'm fairly confident that if we were to reconfigure the CI jobs to not use an external cloud provider, but just like configure them without a provider, a lot of the tests would break or not work. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so we actually have a lot of tests that will work fine. I mean, Kind doesn't configure a cloud provider at all, but there are tests that are covering things that only work with that, and then there's just the bulk of CI is running on like, you know, a cluster using disposable GCE VMs, and so we just need the cloud provider to have the cluster.
Yeah, like I kind of categorize.
Like, we just won't even have a cluster if we don't have a provider.
Yeah, like I kind of categorize our tests into three categories. Like there's tests that like really don't need a provider, and like those tests run on Kind and they should pass performance and whatnot. And then there's like the provider specific tests that are like create a GCE volume or whatever. And then there's like this like weird tests in the middle that are not testing provider behavior, but may rely on provider functionality. Like for example, if there's a test pulling a private GCR image, that is gonna execute the kubelet code to get a token from the GCE metadata server and do that. So I guess what I'm trying to do is, like, I don't want to be in a state where like when we remove the cloud providers, we also disable or remove a bunch of tests. And so I'm trying to get to a state where like when we get there eventually, at the very least, like there are a set of jobs that have been converted to use external providers, so those tests can continue to run as opposed to like just turning them off.
I guess what I'm thinking at is, so I think most of the tests that we should be running in Kubernetes to test Kubernetes should work without any particular provider, except for the part that we need clusters. And I don't think there's been enough push to say like, oh, we're going to run all these with like a single node kubeatom or Kind or something like that, where we don't need that. As soon as we get into like multiple VMs, I mean, we need we need a provider just so that we can like bootstrap a cluster together. I think we could even get to a state where the bulk of what we're covering in pre-submit, if we set aside like node, which is different and unrelated, will work. But there are other things like scale testing where absolutely not, that you're never going to have that, where it doesn't actually care about the provider, but it's never going to work without having a bunch of like real VMs running with substantial compute capacity that we're not going to simulate by like just sticking Kind on a huge VM or something. And
right, like you're making the distinction.
Things,
yeah,
those things I think are still pretty important and a huge portion of CI. Like even if we were like, I don't care about that one test that does some GCR specific thing that probably shouldn't be in Kate's and should be like tested over in the cloud provider repo. The amount of tests that are something more like we want to scale test, so we need a cluster. That's like our default choice for testing Kubernetes and CI is to create a GCE cluster. Because that's where we have like lots and lots and lots of compute. And there are a lot of things where, you know, we haven't made this huge push to like, oh, we're just going to run them all like kind or something. We could go one of those directions. Like I actually think we could get a lot of them to work that way and it would be fine, but there will be some that won't ever. Like scale testing, which is a thing we do in pre-submit today. We do small scale testing. And for those, I'd be hesitant with them. I would probably start by picking something like the Conformance GCE suite and trying to make sure that that's running. But I think we're gonna have to have conversations beyond even like R2 SIGs, for example, with release about like should this be release blocking? What's the motivation?
Yeah, like you're making a distinction.
Like, there's also like a general direction question, like for example in pre-submit, like do we want providers, and if so, like I mean, do we want to go back to having multiple, and if we do, I mean, do we want that to be like a floodgate having lots of them, or do we, if we could, I mean, scale is a question, but if you played scale, we could head in the direction of just like no providers and pre-submit. Either of those, any of those options is going to take, I think, a pretty large investment. And this is one of the things I've been trying to poke people about that I think is going to be the hardest part of actually finishing provider extraction is I don't think we're ready for, there's just a huge amount of CI that's just like, I'm just going to use clusterup.sh and create a GC cluster. And as someone who has gotten an out of tree deployment tool to like pass in CI, it's really hard to get to the point where people like trust the tool and keep things functional and don't just break you with their PRs and then it's blocking. And we as a project cheat a lot by having the GCE and the cluster scripts in the repo so that if you change anything in your PR, like you will wind up inevitably fixing those. Like if you remove a flag from a component or something like that, you have to change those scripts. It is going to be very different when none of the tools live in the repo except sort of Kubatum for now. And there's even talk of moving that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think like one thing I want to make clear is I am kind of willing to, like, I understand like there's a ton of work on this. I am willing to kind of roll up my sleeves and like just go into it and start doing some of the work. But I'm just trying to figure out like the best place to start. And like you made a distinction between depending on a cluster configured with a provider versus like depending on the test deployer, like a provider for the test deployer. Right. And it feels like things can be like tackled separately, where maybe like we start one job that is configured with an external provider, and then we figure out how to like decouple the deployer part of it.
I guess my point is,
yeah,
I think we have tests like this today, but like, putting my head on is just like Kubernetes sig-testing. I don't want things in pre-submit that like actually care about having like a GC provider or something like that. I just want to be testing Kubernetes, and that sounds like something I should be testing in like in the various cloud provider repos. And maybe even it's a common thing they all need to test, and we should have a common test. But I still don't like care about that blocking my CI. But there are the other things where like I am actually just testing Kubernetes that do depend on it, and even for those, just the question of like which one are we using and like how do we keep it stable. I've had some meetings about this in the past, but they haven't really gone anywhere. I can dig up some of that stuff and follow up with you on that. I think I would start by, I believe we actually already have CI for this provider doing some basic tests with kubetest 2. I would take a look at those and see what shape they're in. And then probably next step is like, I mean, where do we want those? Like, do we want to get that into like release blocking, or I think the question remains about how do we version, like what version are we using? And right now, I think they're using an out of tree cluster scripts. That is what I'm saying. I think that's actually going to be very expensive if we switch that to get people to stack those tools.
Makes sense. Okay, so then yeah, that sounds like a good next step though. Like looking at the current jobs that run external providers, if you can send me a link to those, and I will see like what shape they're in. And yeah, I think that's a good starting point, is just stabilizing those and seeing if they actually work and validate what we want.
I'd actually have to look myself. It's been so long since I've been involved, but I think that it's like under cloud provider. I think there's like a dashboard for the GCE repo. But yeah, I don't actually have that handy.
Okay, I'm sure Walter also has some context, so I'll poke into. Cool, thanks, appreciate it.
Thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your Tuesday.